Hello, welcome to the Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. I'm Natalia Shpolova-Said, and thank you so much for joining us today. Our guest is Dr. Olena Palko, and she'll present on attempted genocide, the Soviet regime and its population politics in the early 1930s, the case of the Polish minority. Dr. Olena Palko is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Berber College, London. She received her PhD in history from the University of East Anglia. Her research interest lies in the field of early Soviet history and culture and the interwar history of Eastern Europe. Olena was a visiting fellow at the University of Basel, German Historical Institute Warsaw, and Center Mark Bloch Berlin, and Institute of Human Sciences Vienna. She's the author of Making Ukraine Soviet, Literature and Culture Politics under Lenin and Stalin, which was published in 2020. She's also co-editor of the edited volume Making Ukraine, Negotiating, Contesting, and Drawing Borders in 20th Century Ukraine, which is forthcoming. Olena is also a co-convener of the BASIS study group for minority history. We will start with the lecture. Please submit your comments and questions via the Q&A option, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. All questions and comments will be addressed during our discussion. If you would like to ask your question directly, please let me know by submitting a comment in the chat or our Q&A box, and I'll change your status to the panelist status, and you'll be able to join our discussion. At this point, I would like to welcome Olena, and again, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, hello. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Natalia, for this kind introduction and for inviting me for this seminar series. I'll start sharing my screen. Everything works. Yeah.
Yes,
all right.
Everything works.
Thank you. Before I start, I should mention that in my current research project entitled Contested Minorities, the Transnational History of the Polish-Soviet Borderland, 1918-1938, I do not deal with ethnic-based state-organized violence as such. Instead, I focus on those strategies and state-sponsored programs of ethnic identification that resulted in a unique ethnic proliferation in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. Nonetheless, this paper is my attempt to grapple with one of the main dilemmas puzzling scholars of the interwar Soviet national policies. That is the paradox of simultaneous pursuit of nation building and nation destroying in the Stalinist period. My maternal grandfather, Eduard, and his family were deported to Arkhangelsk in 1932, accused of anti-Soviet agitation. The true reason for their deportation, however, was the fact that my great-grandfather refused to join the collective farm, or kolkhoz. Another important detail that defined the fate of my grandfather's family was their ethnic background. The family was of Polish origin, and in the early 1930s, their ethnicity alone became enough ground for deportation. As the case of my family demonstrates, in the early 1930s, class and ethnicity, two categories that came to underpin the Soviet state and its ideology, concurred. Poles, as well as Germans and Jews, were perceived as being well-off, kulaks by nature in the parlance of the time, and as a result, marked for deportation regardless of their socioeconomic status. In the case of my great-grandfather, being better off meant to have a house with a barn and a well, and some cattle, 2 horses, 2 cows, a few sheep and pigs. After my great-grandfather's arrest, their property was seized and collectivized. Their house was turned into a village convenience store. According to Terry Martin, Poles constituted the first case of explicit ethnic deportation in the Soviet Union. On the 5th of March 1930, the Party Central Committee authorized the deportation of 15,000 kulak families from Ukraine with the added stipulation in the first line, those of Polish nationality. These followed by a deportation of some 10 to 15,000 Poles from the border regions to mainland Ukraine in 1935-36. And a year later, the first wave of Poles from Zhytomyr and Podolia regions, some 36,000 in total, were deported to Kazakhstan. In the wake of the Great Terror, deportation of ethnic populations intensified and were often accompanied by mass executions. In total, in 1937-38, almost 140,000 Soviet Poles were arrested and some 110,000 of them executed. In the so-called German operation, almost 57,000 ethnic Germans were arrested, of whom almost 42,000 were shot. Those Polish and German operations provided a model for other national operations organized by the central government. Among them were the Korean, Chinese, Afghan, Iranian, Greek, Bulgarian, Macedonian, Finnish, and Estonian operations. In addition, a number of smaller operations along the so-called national lines against Latvian, Lithuanians, Norwegians, Sami, Japanese, and Swedes were organized and performed by the local police. Altogether, within the period of 14 months from August 1937 and October 1938, 335,513 people were arrested in the national operation of the NKVD, and 247,557 of them were shot. In the Great Terror, about 1/3 of the total victims of 800,000 people were arrested, deported, and executed on national grounds. Those purges escalated even further during the war years. Almost 80% of Germans in the Soviet Union were deported. Other great waves of deportation unfolded in the southern region from November 1943 to June 1944, and between July and December 1944, that involved Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, and at least 10 other groups. After the war, yet another round of purges affected populations in the western borderlands, especially in the re-annexed Baltic republics and newly incorporated Western Ukraine and Belarus. But is it possible to classify those actions of the Soviet regime as genocide? What intentions did the Soviet government pursue in initiating and performing those acts of ethnic violence? But first, let me tackle the question of who the targets of those state repressive actions were. Who was behind those numbers and ethnic categories? Let me return to my family. As I said, the family of my maternal grandfather was of Polish origin. In their case, it meant the Polish family name, Obodzinski, and the Catholic denomination. It is worth noting that my grandfather, same as his family, did not speak Polish. When my grandfather decided to marry my grandmother Anna, an ethnic Ukrainian, the family did not immediately accept her, mainly because she was an Orthodox Christian. So what did it mean to be Polish in the Soviet sense? What constituted Polishness in the early 1920s, 1930s? Kate Brown aptly summarized this question. To be Polish in a Soviet and proletarian settings was a yet unwritten text, while to be Polish in the old way, religious aristocratic bourgeois, had become a crime. End of quote. Due to my own background and research focus, I will mostly draw on the examples of the Polish minority in Soviet Ukraine. Nonetheless, the processes that I will outline were the same for all national minorities, no matter how small. The Soviet Union, created in late December 1922, presided over an extraordinarily diverse population. The Bolsheviks declared their intention to achieve socialism, and national minorities came to play an equal part in the process of its construction. For the first time, nationality or narodность became a legally defined category and formed the basis for the administrative as well as economic organization of the newly created Soviet Union. These conceptual changes were reflected in the 1926 Soviet census. Sorry, my computer just froze. Can you see?
Yes, we can see the slide 19.
Because I have everything black. Anyway, I'll just 1 second. I don't know what's happening. It's just my screen is just going all the black and yeah. Sorry, now it's back.
Okay, good.
So while in 1897 imperial census, there was no direct question on nationality, and imperial demographers defined the ethnic makeup of the empire by a combination of questions on the native language, religion, and social estate, the category of a self-determined ethnicity became the key determinant for the first Soviet census of 1926. As counted in 1926, 80% of respondents in Soviet Ukraine gave Ukrainian as their nationality, 9.23% Russian, 5.43 Jewish, 1.64 Polish, and 1.36 German. Less numerous were Moldovans, Greeks, Bulgarian, Belarusians, Czechs, Tatars, Gypsies, and Armenians. Scholars define the 1920s as the great era of territorialization of ethnicity, whereby each nationality, no matter how small, was granted the possibility of a self-rule in its native language, which extended downward into smaller and smaller territories, the smallest being the size of a single village. By 1929, there were 26 national districts in Ukraine, out of which 9 were Russian, 7 German, 4 Bulgarian, 3 Greek, 1 Polish, and 2 Jewish. You can see those on the map. The national regions are colored in blue. In addition, 1,089 national village Soviets and 107 town Soviets were established, including some formed for such negligible ethnic groups as Swedes and Albanians. Within those national territorial units, the Soviet states strove to provide access to state institutions, political representation, police and judicial protection, healthcare, education, and cultural opportunities in the minority language. Moreover, for those individuals of minority origin residing beyond respective national territorial units, the state pledged to provide non-territorial autonomy with similar access to services in minority languages and guarantee of national rights. Poles constituted the largest after Russians and Jews minority group in Soviet Ukraine. Actually, Ukraine was home for almost half of the Soviet Union's Polish population. Most Poles lived compactly in Ukraine's western provinces of Volhynia, Podolia, and Kyiv. There, as elsewhere in Ukraine, Poles were organized into national Soviets. By 1929, 150 Polish national Soviets were created across Ukraine. Moreover, in 1925, following the official decree from 1922, the first and only Polish national region in Soviet Ukraine was established in the Volhynia province, some 120 kilometers east from the Polish border. This autonomous district occupied an area of 650 square kilometers with 42,000 inhabitants, out of which less than 70% were recorded as Poles. The center of the Polish region was in Dolbych, soon renamed Marchlewsk, to commemorate late Polish Bolshevik Julian Marchlewski. In theory, the belonging to a particular national Soviet depended on a person's self-declared nationality. In reality, however, the authorities often intervened into this process, redrawing administrative lines to achieve ethnic homogeneity in certain locations, or separating national Soviets with little regard to the wishes of the local population. The Polish region was established in economically and socially backward area. It was far from the railway. There was no telephone or telegraph. The only industry was a ceramic factory, opened in 1840, that renewed its activity in 1922. By 1925, the area remained predominantly peasant. They constituted 92% of the total population. Literacy was low, 47% for men and 37% for women, with only 4% of household collectivized, the lowest out of all national units. There, Poles received territorial and cultural autonomy. Religious practices for Roman Catholics were allowed, albeit under strict party supervision. The Polish region could boast its own newspaper in Polish, Sowiat Marchlewszczyzna. Moreover, the district has preferential access to state funding and allowed for accelerated modernization of the region and its population. When deciding on the establishment of national Soviets, the Soviet officials were faced with national ambiguity of the local population. In the right bank Ukraine, the area with the most numerous Polish population, local identities were complex, with entangled language, culture, and religion. Unlike Poles, other minority groups were easier to differentiate. Jews were defined by religion and the common experience of movement restrictions. Greeks and Bulgarians by compact settlement in the south of the republic and distinct language. And Germans, although organized around different religious groups and different vernaculars, enjoyed a special autonomous status until the 1980s, which made them more recognizable in cultural and social terms. Instead, Poles were ambiguous. Identities in the western part of Ukraine were so entangled that it became almost impossible to differentiate a Ukrainian from a Pole. I should perhaps mention that the region of Volhynia until the last partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1795 belonged to Poland, and Polish elites never stopped opposing the Russian imperial administration, resulting in two major anti-Tsarist revolts. The imperial administration responded with repressive measures against the Polish population. There were no Polish schools, the use of the Polish language was prohibited, hence high level of assimilation. In addition, thanks to mixed marriages, as well as the imperial approach to categorize all children born in those mixed marriages as Orthodox Christian, in the private setting, many switched to Ukrainian or used a mixture of the two. The imperial legacy posed a great challenge to the Bolshevik plans. As demonstrated by the official inspection of the Polish population in the Volhynia region in 1925, Polish was used by the absolute minority of the local Catholic population. When asked why people would use Ukrainian instead, some answered that it was a habit and that they didn't know that, I quote, such freedom for the Polish language existed, end of quote. At the same time, local population could hardly differentiate between religion and nationality, with all Catholics being regarded simply as Poles. Those in the middle, Ukrainian Catholics, posed the biggest concern. Their national identity mattered since, depending on classification, these people were to be subjected either to the Ukrainization policies as a titular Ukrainian nation or to the minorities policies as Poles. For the Ukrainian lobby, Ukrainian Catholics were Polonized by the Catholic Church Ukrainians, whereas for the Polish lobby, they were Poles, assimilated under the Tsarist autocracy. And unfortunately, in the Soviet statistics, those people of ambiguous identity could not be placed in two categories simultaneously. In this war, the minority specialists had won. And it is safe to suggest that the steady increase in numbers of Poles in Ukraine between 1923, when there were some 90,000 Poles, and 1926, with already 369,612 Poles, was due to the recategorization of those Ukrainian Catholics as Poles. In terms of one particular village of Stara Sinyava, the change was from 20 Poles and 2,006 Ukrainian Catholics in 1924 to 2,325 Poles and no Ukrainians in 1925. As explained by the party officials, before people were afraid of their identity, but now the Polish population is flourishing. This is a quote, thanks to our nationality politics. And the number that is in 1925 is 309,800 Poles, 22% of whom are definitely Poles, end of quote, referring to those who spoke the Polish language. Thereafter, minority specialists worked tirelessly to promote Polish and teach their native language to those categorized as Poles. As mentioned before, there were Polish language schools, reading huts, and literacy rooms in the Polish language. There were crash language courses for governmental employees. Pedagogical institutes were created to prepare teachers and educators. But why did minorities matter so much? Why did Soviet authorities pay so much attention to categorizing the population along ethnic lines and promoting their ethnic identification? In the Soviet context, the minority question was particularly sensitive. In reaching out to minorities, Soviet leaders pursued a number of objectives. The most pressing concern was the need to consolidate the Soviet rule in non-Russian ethnically diverse provinces. The arduous civil war experience on the imperial frontiers raised the question of a necessary cooperation with the local population. In terms of small Western minorities, such as Germans and Poles, there was also an urgent need to shift their loyalties, especially given the support they offered to their kin states during the German occupation of Ukraine in 1918 and brief Polish occupation in 1920. To engage minorities into the Soviet state building, however, the party needed to overcome a century-long legacy of their distrust of central Russian institutions. As highlighted by Stalin, in order to make Soviet power, I quote, near and dear to the masses of the border regions of Russia, end of quote, it was necessary to integrate all the best local people into the Soviet administration. This was meant in this regard, the use of native languages also meant to ease the process of their political socialization. In addition, the continuum of crisis had left the country devastated. The economy, already damaged by the war effort, was ruined. War communism only exacerbated the chaos. To fulfill their vision of progress, the Bolsheviks were in dire need to modernize the country. But to modernize backward regions meant to standardize them, to order them by national categories. Preferential treatment of minorities has a broader implication too. The Central Party leadership did not stop treating Western national minorities such as Poles or Germans with suspicion, especially given the widespread fear of the Polish invasion in the late 1920s. To prevent minorities from siding with their home states, the idea was to reduce national discontent, hence the influence of the respective governments in case of a future war. Particular emphasis was placed on poor and middle peasants that constituted the majority of the Polish minority population, who could benefit the most from the Soviet modernization effort. While fear of foreign invasion was a dominant security concern of the day, ostentatiously generous treatment of minorities within the Soviet borders could also provide a positive outlook of the Soviet Union abroad and help spread communism beyond its western borders. In fact, every opportunity was used to contrast the Soviet preferential treatment of its minorities to the assimilatory policies of the Second Polish Republic. At the 5th anniversary of the Polish Marchlewsk region in 1930, Jan Saulewicz, the vice director of the Governmental Commission of National Minority Affairs, explained that the Polish autonomous region served as an example for workers and peasants just across the Polish border that a proletarian society based on Polish culture was indeed possible. But let me go back to the main question of this presentation. Why within less than a decade the Soviet authorities would come to abandon its strategy of ethnic proliferation and instead start using those state-imposed national categories against their bearers, subject an entire minority population to Russification and assimilation, ethnic terror and deportation? In his seminal work, Stephen Kotkin proposed to view Stalinism as civilization, a progressive modernity. Those scholars who have followed his interpretation regarded Stalinism as an Enlightenment phenomenon, whereby the Soviet political project was founded on the ambition to create a new harmonious society on rational scientific principles. Hence, the Soviet authorities desired to transform the socio-economic order and refashion society, and in doing so, the state was ready to employ unprecedented level on social intervention. In attaining this future socialist utopia, the Soviet authorities expected allegiance of their minority population. They would be politically and socially active, eager to contribute to the Soviet modernization effort and join the Soviet apparatus. They would, using Kotkin's phrase, speak Bolshevik, although in a variety of national languages. They relied on, in Kate Brown's words, the art of persuasion via enlightenment. A number of cultural, educational, and ideological initiatives were launched that aimed to bring ethnic population closer to socialism through the means of their native languages. But by the late 1920s, however, the art of persuasion had reached its limits, never attaining the objectives it was meant to fulfill. Although categorized along national lines, as the primary sources suggest, local communities continued to hold strong to their hybrid and their identities and local cultures. They preferred to stay away from the party and ignored its initiatives. They did not want to join collective farms and continued to distrust the Soviet regime. Following the perspective of enlightenment, the state resorted to violence to accelerate the process of creating a pure community by excising those obstructive to the Soviet project. And in search for evil, class and ethnicity concurred. Mass deportation of population from the border zones commenced in spring 1930, with many of those targeted as kulaks being repressed only because of their ascribed ethnicity. In his attempt to explain the paradox of simultaneous pursuit of nation building and nation destroying in the Stalinist period, Martin suggests that ethnic terror became an, I quote, unintended consequence, end of quote, of the Soviet modernizing mission. Instead of transcending national identities, Soviet strategies of ethnic stratification and ethnic labeling turned the impersonal category of nationality into a, quote, valuable form of social capital, end of quote. Those state-imposed national categories started to be used on the ground to voice local interest. The launch of the collectivization campaign initiated mass immigration movements among almost all of the Soviet Union's Western national minorities. Hundreds of Poles fled the Polish-Soviet border. Other Poles engaged in mass demonstrations demanding their right to emigrate. These immigration movements became a sign that the Soviet Piedmont principle, according to which national minorities were meant to attract their brethren across the border to communism, had failed. Instead, when collectivization and famine threatened their livelihood, Poles and Germans used their national identities to seek help from respective consulates and petition to leave, thus repudiating their Soviet fatherland. What is more, those actions reinforced Soviet security concerns and exacerbated the fear of foreign subversion. In addition, there was a violent resistance to collectivizations throughout non-Russian periphery, with the worst peasant uprising taking place in the Polish-Ukrainian border in the late February 1930. It should be said that the Polish minority remained the hardest to collectivize. Even in 1929, only 69% of households, still the lowest among the minorities, joined collective farms. Coupled with the immigration movement, the opposition to collectivization raised the question of loyalty of its population. Soviet authorities responded with ethnic cleansing of Soviet borderlands and ultimately ethnic terrors throughout the Soviet Union. A historian of Germany, Erich Weitz, proposed another approach to understanding the nature of the Soviet ethnic terror under Stalin. In a 2002 Slavic Review forum on the topic of race, Weitz argues that Stalin's massive deportation of certain groups during the 1930s, 1940s constituted, I quote, a racial politics without the concept of race, end of quote. As a known specialist on Nazi Germany, Weitz observed certain similarities between the two regimes. Racial politics was one of those. While the Soviets explicitly rejected the ideology of race, with such, using Stalin's term, zoological thinking being a characteristic of the Nazi system and degenerate bourgeois society in general, Weitz argues that traces of racial politics crept into Soviet nationalist policies, especially during the Great Terror and the war period. Certain national groups who proved to be particularly resistant to the socialist appeal were targeted as enemy nations, leading to their arrest, forced deportation, and resettlement. As Amir Weiner put it, I quote, enemy groups previously considered to be differentiated, reformable, and redeemable were now viewed as undifferentiated, unreformable, and irredeemable collectives, end of quote. Weitz maintains that, I quote, race is present when a defined population group is seen to have particular characteristics that are indelible, immutable, and transgenerational, end of quote. Race is fate, claims Weitz. According to him, certain national groups targeted as enemies of socialism became racialized in the sense that their suspect characteristics were seen to inhere in each and every member of the group and were transmitted across the generations. Weitz maintains that, I quote, the Soviet drive to remake the very composition of its citizenry, to remove targeted population groups from the social body, to cast certain nations as pariahs for eternity, and to drive them into internal exile, thus invite legitimate comparison with Nazi policies, even though the Soviets themselves explicitly rejected the comparison, end of quote. It was this racial logic that made Weitz's approach highly controversial. Numerous scholars of the inter-Soviet Union attacked Weitz for obscuring, I quote, important differences between Soviet and Nazi regimes, end of quote. One of the critics was Francine Hirsch, a renowned scholar of the Soviet nationality question. Although the Soviet regime practiced politics of discrimination and exclusion, Hirsch rejects that those were committed as part of racial politics. In Soviet thought, nationalities like classes were conceptualized as socio-historical groups with a shared consciousness and not racial biological groups. Same as classes would once disappear under socialism, so would separate nationalities eventually merge into the Soviet international whole. The Soviet case presents several important differences to Nazi Germany. First, Soviet experts were tasked to provide scientific evidence for differentiating race and nationality, up to the point that there were two different disciplines dealing with those categories. Ethnographers dealt with national cultures, whereas anthropologists with racial differences. In the process of historical development, both racial and national distinctions would gradually disappear, leading to the unification of people into new ethno-historical units, nationalities and nation, based on shared language, culture, and consciousness. While German anthropologists were concerned with racial purity, their Soviet colleagues described racial mixing as a byproduct of a socio-historical development, as a sign of an advanced society. Second, the focus on race obscures an important aspect of evolution of ethnic repression in the Soviet Union. At least during the pre-war years, Soviet repressive policies were aimed at specific territories, mainly border regions populated by minorities with an external homeland or politically suspicious segments of these communities, but not entire peoples. The list of deportees from villages with a quote concentrated Polish and German population and of quote were to include, as in the case of my great grandfather, independent peasants who did not fulfill their obligations to the government and unreliable collective farmers. Once those harmful elements were removed, many more minority representatives remain in the region. It is also of note that deportees often stayed within the boundaries of Soviet Ukraine. There were no instances of intentional murder of those populations at this time. The matters changed with the outbreak of the war, when minorities started to be targeted in its entirety and deported to Kazakhstan, mainly with executions becoming a commonplace. Third, there was an important difference in the way those representatives of different nationalities, especially those of enemy nations, were treated by the authorities. In contrast to Weitz, Hirsch argues that there was no racial stigmas in the Soviet context. The Soviet regime did not persecute nationalities because of so-called biological weakness. Neither did it brand particular nationalities as biological inferior or degenerate races. Instead, they targeted people for their lack of allegiance and loyalty to the Soviet state, characterizing those as bourgeois nationalities, disloyal people, and enemy nations. The respective repressive measures were implemented as a reaction to the threat of nationalism internally and fear of foreign intervention externally, not least due to Poland's attempts to protect ethnic Poles across the border, using various mechanisms provided through their diplomatic services and the Roman Catholic Church. In addition to Soviet security paranoia, the persistent opposition of certain ethnic minority groups of the Soviet policies, collectivization in particular, led to a widespread concern that those nationalities could not be reinvented as Soviet nation, threatening the entire success of the Soviet socialist project. In my conclusion, I would like to refer back to the main question of my presentation. Did the Soviet state attempt genocide of its numerous diverse non-Russian populations? According to the UN definition, to be regarded as genocide, certain acts need to be committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, ethical, racial or religious group. The word genocide was first coined by Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin in 1944, mostly in response to the Nazi policies of systematic murder of Jewish people during the Holocaust. Not trying to whitewash the Soviet regime and its numerous crimes against individuals and groups, ethnic included, I maintain that it is important to distinguish between states that commit genocide and genocidal regimes. Nazi racial politics resulted in genocide because they strove not just to exclude particular groups from the nation, but to eliminate their genetic material altogether. By contrast, the Soviet regime did not aspire to eliminate its nationalities. Instead, it strove to reinvent its people as loyal Soviet citizens. And this aim did not necessarily require murder. In fighting any form of nationalism, the authorities initiated a campaign to eradicate national cultures of targeted ethnic groups. Schools were closed down or converted to Ukrainian language schools. National regions were liquidated, and most drastically, the populations were forcibly resettled from their historic places of settlement. The Polish Autonomous District, of which I spoke earlier, was reformed in 1935 and split between other administrative units, thus drawing a line to Red Polonia, as this experiment was often dubbed. It is worth mentioning that the Soviet purification drive was like other states in Europe who wished to modernize their country and its people and resorted to social engineering to achieve this. So was the case of post-war Poland and Czechoslovakia, or earlier Turkey and Greece. Whatever the ideology, social engineering is accompanied with violence. No doubt the Soviet regime had the operational capacity to systematically murder all members of selected nationalities. Instead, they preferred mass deportation of those selected groups. Not surprisingly, the brutality of deportation resulted in countless deaths. Upon arrival somewhere in the open steppes of Kazakhstan, deportees were labeled special settlers, damned to a life of hard labor and denied civil rights. Among those special settlers, the mortality rate was incredibly high. For example, by 1948, out of those 600,000 people deported from the Caucasus between 1943 and 44, almost 20% had died. On this slide, you can see some accounts for that horror as presented in popular culture. The Crimean Tatar film Haytarma from 2013 about the deportation of the Crimean Tatars in 1944, and a book, also a mini-series, Zuleyha, Open Your Eyes by Guzel Yahina, about the Tatar experience in special settlements in Russia's Far East. But even at the height of ethnic-based purges, assimilation or reintegration into Soviet society remained possible. For example, female settlers who married men of other nationalities in the region of resettlement and rejected their old cultures could be re-established as Soviet citizens. War provided another possibility to redeem themselves, to prove loyalty to the Soviet state. In April 1942, former kulaks were allowed to join military service, with their families released from special settlements and received passports. Later that year, 43,000 Poles, labeled as representatives of an enemy nation only 2 years before, were released from Gulag. Those options were hardly imaginable for a person of Jewish origin under the Nazi regime. If you allow me, I will conclude this presentation with yet another reference to my family. On this photo, you can see my great-uncle Bronislaw Obodzinski, born in 1922. When the war broke out, the family still lived in Arkhangelsk. The war forced the Soviet authorities once again resort to the mobilizing power of nationalism and turn to its ethnic populations. In May 1943, out of the Polish population, mostly those repressed and deported to the far north or east, the Polish army was formed. With some 400,000 people, it was the biggest regular formation fighting alongside the Soviet Red Army. My great-uncle was one of those Poles who was mobilized by the Polish army and fought until the last days of the war. On the Victory Day, he was in Berlin. After the war, he remained in Poland, where his units laid the foundation to the Polish armed forces. While in Poland, he was not allowed even to write to his family, which by that time had already returned to Ukraine, to Shepetivka, a small town not far from their original home, from where they had been deported only almost 20 years prior. As a testament to the effectiveness of the Soviet authorities' re-education potential, the family mostly spoke Russian, and in public setting, my grandfather Eduard preferred to use a Russian-sounding name Nikolai. As to my great-uncle, in the early 1950s, the Polish Republic launched its own cleansing campaign, and Bronislaw, or Uncle Bronek, as we used to call him, this time categorized as Ukrainian, was expelled from the military and forced out of the country. In search of his family, he went first to Arkhangelsk, where he learned of his family whereabouts. Soon he joined them in Shepetivka. The family was rehabilitated only after the collapse of the Soviet Union by the law of Ukraine from 17 April 1991. As you can see here on the slide, this is their original rehabilitation certificate dated from 27 July 1992. Thank you for your attention and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Olena. Do you mind if you stop sharing your screen so that we could
Yes.
have some discussion? Yes, please submit your comments and your questions. And while we're waiting for our first comments, I would like you to I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on those reasons why, in your opinion, based on your research, those initiatives of the 20s were curtailed in the 30s. The 20s are known for being very vibrant, not only in terms of, like you demonstrated today in the presentation, nationality policies, but also in literature, in culture in general. But then the 30s, just like with the nationality policies, culture didn't experience as much of this vibrant development. And as we know, some tragic events started taking place in the 30s. So if you could elaborate on those reasons, in your opinion, what contributed to the cancellation of the policies which were first introduced in the 20s?
Thank you. It's a very good question, and I think this is kind of the main question which I was trying to solve with this presentation. I think from my point of view, I think the main reason is that this Soviet idea of progressive, gradual Sovietization of people uh, basically failed, and we can see it in all different spheres: literature, culture, religion, nationalities policies, and so on. Um, I'm also working currently on a paper in which I explore a case of one of the Polish priests in the early 1920s, in the mid 1920s. This is this period of religious nap. And the idea was that people, if you kind of start kind of try to undermine the authority of the church, people will turn away, but it didn't happen. People, like during by the end of the 1920s, that there was like some kind of the new revival of religious beliefs. People were going more and more to the church. And so we can say in all different spheres, this nationality politics or minority politics included. We have all those programs and initiatives that for the first time perhaps allowed people to learn their language, because obviously until 1917 they were not able to. Perhaps they were not reading the classical works of Polish literature, but they were reading more of those Soviet Polish writers. But at the same time, I think this idea of a nationality kind of it got really ingrained in those people, and they started understanding themselves in national categories rather than class categories, or this kind of seeing themselves as Poles rather than Soviet Poles. And that's why I think there was this sudden crash, understanding that those expectation of gradual evolutionary way to socialism and Sovietization, it failed. And that's why this is when kind of the party responded with violence to basically speed up the process or to gain those results that they needed. And obviously in the end of the 1920s, we have this industrialization drive. There was no more time to wait until people will grow into socialism. They needed these people to join this modernization and industrialization effort, meaning that kind of there's some more expedient methods needed to be found.
Thank you. Thank you, Olena. We have a question in the chat. There is considerable Polish and some Ukrainian literature on the subject genocide against the Poles. Can you say a few words on what new contributions do you think your work will make?
So yes, I know of a lot of example of this literature, and the thing is that, as I said in the at the beginning of my presentation, my main focus of my research is actually on the policies of the 1920s. I always had this the knowledge of ethnic purges in the hindsight, but I always wanted to understand like why. So as why did it happen, right? Why there was this sudden turn, a break from the 1920s to the 1930s in all those Soviet policies. And as such, I'm not really, I don't think I'm breaking new grounds with this particular presentation, because this was just my attempt to understand for myself why and how did it happen. Instead, I believe that what I'm doing with my original project, the one on the 1920s on the minorities experiment, and in regards to Poles, this is the one where I could make kind of a more substantial contribution to scholarship. So it's perhaps because I'm kind of acknowledging that with this presentation, I'm not really I'm not really opening anything new, and there has been a lot of scholarship definitely in Poland, because there is a lot of, well, we can say, bias of this kind of trying to see the history of Poles in Ukraine from this perspective of ethnic terror, the fate that happened to Poles later on. Same as in Ukraine in regards to Ukrainian, there is this competition of victimhood, we could say. But yeah, and this is why one of the reasons why I decided to look at the 1920s instead of the 1930s and the terror is that there is considerable literature about the ethnic cleansing and ethnic terror. But why did it happen again? So I kind of, in my original research, I reversed the question. Instead of saying like, why did it lead to terror? I want to understand, why did terror happen, right? What was the like, why did they need to turn to terror and ethnic cleansing? Why did it fail, like their previous project? And this is why I'm kind of trying to look back at the 1920s with the knowledge of what happened in the 1930s.
I really appreciate you sharing some fragments from your family story. I'm wondering if you had a chance to somehow explore what was the reason for resistance in your particular family against the collectivization and against the Sovietization. And the more I hear stories like that, the more I read about stories like that, I realize there are a lot of them because in my family, we have a similar story. But in spite of the fact that some members in my family were even beaten up to death by the communists during the collectivization, they were crying when Stalin died. I mean, their relatives cried when Stalin died, and they knew what happened, and they lost all their property. And one of the family members was killed during actually his defense of what he thought belonged to him, but according to communists, it wasn't his property anymore. So in this case, it was resistance which was caused by some probably unwillingness to accept this new regime and unwillingness to even mentally understand that property will not belong to them anymore. Did you have a chance to look into your family history and what they resisted the most?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's I'm thinking that one of the reasons why they resisted is because the policies, the Soviet policies, were not linear, right? All this is happening amidst the new economic policy, right? That kind of allowed more liberalization. There was kind of some sort of elements of market economy. Peasants were allowed to have their land, to have their cattle, and so on and so on. So I think the fact that it was so non-linear, people didn't really know what's happening and why it is happening. Why in one day they are allowed to have something and the next day somebody comes and says, well, all this is national property, it needs to be nationalized, collectivized, and so on. So I would think that one of the reasons is that there was this lack of understanding or kind of graduality in Soviet policies, kind of again like towards perhaps like kind of the peasant population. But at the same time, I think it's natural. Why should one want to give away their property, right? That's something that they really kind of worked for, and something that really kind of this was the basis of their livelihood. And I think it's also this idea of a kolkhoz. It was not necessarily something that could understand and so on. So I think it's natural and understandable that people did resist. And in your question, you mentioned like some of your family members who were later crying for Stalin, and it is actually also very interesting because like my paternal grandfather, he was the most devoted communist I have ever seen. He used to say that if newspaper wrote this, it means it's true, right? Like this is like how communist he was until like his last days. But at the same time, later in his life, he started remembering Holodomor. And he said, I never remembered it, but now that I hear these stories, I do remember myself like small, that I was already wider than tall, like all these things. And still, I think this is also kind of, so this memory that has been repressed somewhere comes back. But it didn't prevent him from being a member of the Communist Party and being grateful to everything he has got. He got from the Communist Party, because he was the first person or the only person out of my grandparents who actually had a higher degree. He finished university, so he had the social promotion did work for him. And I think this is also why many of them were sort of, perhaps, I don't know, like loyal in a way that they could see the results of the system of this, like kind of on their personal lives.
Thank you. And my next question will be about probably what we can describe as situational identities and this switch over from, in this case, from Poles to Ukrainians, from Ukrainians to Poles. And I'm wondering how this displacement was impacting this kind of switch over, if we can put it this way. Just the other day, I had a wonderful opportunity to listen to other stories about displacement. And again, in this case, it was the same story from Poland to Kazakhstan. But they were also asked this question whether their Polishness was somehow impacted by the fact that now they lived in Kazakhstan and new children were there as well. And they said that no, my Polishness didn't change, and the Polishness of my children didn't change either. Well, which of course raises a lot of questions, but what's your what's your opinion on that? And maybe you had a chance to come across some findings as well in this kind of area.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would think that those people who are gathered together by ethnic kind of criteria would think more, in ethnic category about kind of themselves and share perhaps like, same sort of, I don't know, like kind of cultural initiatives or language or so on. Yeah, it's a good question, but to be honest, like all my conversations with my grandfather, they were all about like we always knew that they were Polish, but for us, Polish also meant that they were Catholics. So Polishness was not really, it wasn't reflected in the language, it wasn't reflected in any traditions other than Catholic traditions, if it makes sense. And actually myself, when I wanted to apply for this Polish card, to prove my Polish origin, I needed to learn all these things by myself and kind of even try to sort of refashion my family, saying that they are actually Poles, although they were not, they and based on his memories also in about his life in Arkhangelsk, they were not really practicing any life other than Soviet life. All his memories were about him looking forward to foreign ships coming to the harbor to sell something and get some money, but there was nothing about like I don't know, sort of cultural, ethnic, national identity. So it's an interesting question, and I think it's also kind of it's interesting how these people were repressed for their ethnic or kind of based on their ethnic belonging, but at the same time they themselves didn't really practice any of that. And yeah, but I don't really know, kind of answer to this question.
There is some sense of not restoration, but maybe some sense of return to this multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity in many areas in Ukraine. Do you see any repercussions maybe of this multiculturalism developments in today's Ukraine, either negatively or positively?
Well, I would say it's only positive. I regret that I never learned Polish, like kind of when growing up, that we never had any Polish component, in my upbringing. I would really appreciate having watched something in Polish or so on, just because this is, part of my history. But at this, so I don't really see any problems with multiculturalism. I think as long as it can, serve as a benefit for people, same as like the fact that one can speak Ukrainian and Russian. I don't see I mean, obviously should be like one state language and you only have one native language, but if you know another language, it's a great advantage of our society. And I would like to know also Polish, just because I'm myself from Shepetivka, from Western Ukraine. We were closer to perhaps like kind of those Western influences. When I grew up, all this kind of the policies of the Polish state to sort of attract people back to Poland and kind of return them to their roots, it intensified. We had a Polish school and so on, but somehow I wasn't a part of that. And honestly, I regret that. It wouldn't make me any less Ukrainian. It's just would give me the advantage of knowing the language better than I do now, right? That kind of I needed to, perhaps I kind of master it later for my work, but at the same time I could have known it already. So yeah, I don't really see a problem with multiculturalism.
Mhm. And what's your next stage? As you pointed out, that probably you're not covering any new discoveries with this presentation, but what's your next stage for your research in terms of this topic?
So I'm working on those strategies of during the 1920s, and I'm tackling different aspects. So at the conference, this Taras Shevchenko conference, I presented one of the papers that was based on analyzing who those Poles were, how the Soviet statistic treated those people, and so on. Then, as I mentioned, I'm working on the article about the mid 1920s religious policies and how they tackled people of kind of Polish-born Catholic priests in Ukraine. So I'm trying to. I don't. It's. I at first I thought that this project would be a book project, but when I started working on it, it kind of felt that there is so much to do that it's actually hard to synthesize it as a single book, and that's why I'm kind of picking some stories and developing them separately, and then at some point we will see it might grow into a book, but at a later stage when I will have more like a kind of broad understanding of every kind of, and I will be able to synthesize those policies rather than looking at particular kind of smaller stories and storylines.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Olena. And thank you for this conversation, which again reminded us of the highly contested nationality policies under the Soviet regime. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you once again for inviting me.
Today we spoke with Dr. Olena Palko, who presented on attempted genocide, the Soviet regime and its population politics in the early 1930s, the case of the Polish minority. Thank you for attending our lecture. Information about upcoming events will be posted on the UkrSO listserv and our Facebook page, Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. You can view previous lectures and talks on our YouTube channel, and for future recorded events, please subscribe to our channel. Again, thank you so much for joining us today.